we needed headphones for this? Yes.
Oh, I don't know.
You sound fine though, Grace.
Yeah.
I don't know if you need them.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you sound fine. All right, and we are live. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this film panel. I'm really excited to introduce Eurie Chung, who is our moderator today. She's In addition, we have who is a director of programs at CAM, Center for Asian and Mara, who's a filmmaker, and Grace Lee, who and leave and have this awesome panel. Thank you so much, Eurie, for moderating.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again. And in case you're wondering, these people have been gathered together because I've been working with them for a very long time, actually. And it's kind of cool. I don't know if we've ever all kind of gathered in this way to chat, but it's good to see you all. I guess we'll just get started. The first question is, what drew you to film and how does this medium continue to inspire you? We can maybe start with Dawn and then have everyone answer the question. Yeah.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here, and thanks, Eurie. It'll be fun. Yeah, because I don't think we've all gathered. We all talk in very, very, very differently or different combinations of each other, right? So it's great to be here. I came to this because of and I think all of us are particularly in this year. We think we're reminded a lot about how we came into the work that we do, trying to figure out how to do it differently, better, responsibly. I started back in the late 80s. When I was as an undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara, there was a whole wave of Asian American documentaries. Lonnie Ding, Stephen Okazaki, Visual Communications. There were, Who Killed Vincent Chin? There were many films that were starting to emerge in about a 5-year period that really inspired me personally and intrigued me and made me want to do this work. And I got to meet folks like Lonnie Ding, who was important for many of us in the field. So that's what specifically drew me into this work. Well, and then just parallel, I should note, because I thought about it a lot lately when I was finding my way, two very public campaigns were happening. There was a lot of public conversation about what happened to Vincent Chin, his murder, and the social justice movements that happened. And then also some of my early exposure to activism was there were campaigns going around to formulating signatures for reparations, right? So yeah, that was all happening.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if anybody doesn't know, I'm from the East Coast, so I came to Los Angeles in 2002, and like I also encountered visual communications and these community organizations. So that's sort of a similar kind of parallel, I guess, for us. What about you, Tad?
Yeah, even though I was kind of born and raised around Asian American filmmaking community, both my parents are filmmakers, documentary filmmakers. I really didn't start making films or even thought about making films until I was an undergraduate at UCLA, and I took my dad's class, the ethno-communications class, and that's actually through that program is actually where I first met you, Eurie, and that Grace. I don't know if you remember, but you were a guest speaker in one of our classes. So that's the first time I met you. So yeah, it was through the ethno-communications program, but really it was also through kind of my activism as a student and a community member. I was really kind of looking for how different ways I can contribute to the different campaigns we were doing, and having taken that class, and also to coming from the family and background that I do, realized that cameras, filmmaking, editing equipment, those were some of the privileges that I had that I could kind of bring to the table to contribute. And it kind of from there, from the Ethnic Communications program, I kind of really liked making films, and that's why I decided to go to the social documentation program up in UC Santa Cruz for my master's program, and specifically to study under Renee Tajima Pena and Spencer Nakasako. And I think it was while I was a student there is when I really got connected with Cam on a personal level. Cam always, screened my films, but that's when, because I was closer, was able to visit the office and then started developing a relationship with Don personally. But both Cam and Flash Cuts has really, supported all my films. So we can talk about that later also.
Sure. All right, Grace, how about you?
Wow. So now being in this square with all of you is bringing back all kinds of things to say. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a filmmaker, but I was always really interested in storytelling and writing and journalism. I grew up in Columbia, Missouri, so I didn't even have access to anything Asian American in terms of like studies or film festivals and things like that. But I think I really became kind of smitten by filmmaking, or at least intrigued. When I finished college, I lived in Korea for a couple of years, and I ended up volunteering at this organization that was supporting Korean women who were in relationships working around American military bases in the bars and brothels around there. And I met another Korean American filmmaker who had just finished her kind of documentary program, and we decided to make a short film called Camp Arirang, which sort of looked at the stories of some of these women. And that was really my introduction. I thought, wow, this is a different way of storytelling. It's visual, sort of uses a camera instead of a pen. This is more interesting. I'm intrigued. And that took me back to the States, where I actually took my very first film class at Third World Newsreel, which kind of proves to be interesting later on, because at the time it was a kind of low-cost film workshop for people of color. And so that was my first training by J.T. Takagi and Herman Liu. They happened to be Asian Americans who are leading that program. Eventually, through Third World Newsreel, I actually met Lonnie Ding. This is my connection to Dawn. When she was working on her Ancestors. No, she had started working on Ancestors in America, or pre-production, and she needed a production assistant in New York Chinatown, and I think JT told me about it, and so Lonnie hired me, and that's how I got to know her. And then about a year later, she asked me if I wanted to move to San Francisco and work with her, and that's when Dawn was leaving to go to CAM, I think, right? Or somewhere.
Leaving.
Somewhere else, yeah. So that's how I met Dawn, and then anyway, that was the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, what's really funny, I guess, about this particular group is just how important the community aspect of it is to all of our journeys, right? Like a lot of us went to UCLA or UC system, but like through like visual communications and Lonnie Ding, and for me, Walt Louis, who was very close with Lonnie Ding. And so it's like these sort of mentors almost sort of like shaped how we make our films, I think, is actually maybe somewhat appropriate, or just what our approach is to the genre. I don't know if I was like, if I like came to Hollywood and tried to make films in that way, if I'd even still be around, right? Like that wasn't a goal of mine either. So thanks for all kind of sharing our weird family tree of Asian American documentary. The next question is, what challenges and opportunities in Asian American representation in film do you see? So see coming ahead of us. It's a kind of a big question, I guess. A big hot topic is representation right now. I don't know, Grace, do you want to start with that? Challenges and opportunities for Asian American representation right now.
For representation. I think what's interesting, so I'm one of the co-founders of ADOC, the Asian American Documentary Network, which was sort of came together about 4 years ago, sort of out of this need for us to share resources, uplift filmmakers who are Asian American working in nonfiction, kind of mentor each other, sort of build community. And I think it's been really interesting these last 4 years just to see how that has kind of manifested itself. In 4 years, I think ADOC has really become, has become recognized in our field as kind of a, force in a way. The challenges for representation, I think we have so much talent, and we have a lot of talent in our community, but I think, and Don can speak to this too, we still don't have the same amount of opportunity that we should be having, or the same amount of resources that should be, sort of afforded us, given the amount of experience and track record that we do have. Yeah, I'll just start with that. You guys, we can all riff on it.
Yeah,
I feel like more
John,
like
coming from the CAM perspective, what are you seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, to Grace's point, the last decade, I think, has been a very historic, powerful moment, right? Whereby Black Lives Matter, Oscar So White, Me Too. There's been a lot of society-wide movements for demanding change, which has been important, valuable, I think, table setting. And then 2016, Grace, so many organizations started to come of age, right? Or just like popped up with very urgent, important perspectives that have reshaped our landscape. ADOC, Brown Girls Doc Mafia, DPA, there are different organizations that are looking at opportunity and equity. That said, there are clearly parallel universes where everybody's watching streaming, like Netflix and Hulu, and there are these commercial opportunities for nonfiction filmmakers that are afforded to perhaps 24 filmmakers in a community of 10,000 plus, right? And I think that speaks to both the commercialism that's penetrated documentary film, but tying it up, connected with this conversation, this community, the Asian American Pacific Islander voices have gotten very limited, if no access to those spaces. And I think it's an exciting time, but certainly exciting times in terms of the development of a voice, but whether those voices can all tell stories, that's the question on the table right now, right?
I mean, Tad, do you have any personal perspectives on this with your own work, or that if you feel comfortable sharing or anything?
I think it is, both Grace and Don said, I think on one hand, for when people think about Asian American representation, I think we kind of automatically think of on more of the narrative scripted side. And I think, we have made, not enough, but we have made big strides, on the narrative television side. And then on the other hand, just documentary in general, mainly because of the streaming services like Netflix and Hulu. I think more people are watching documentaries in general, but I think the challenge will also be specifically for Asian American documentaries to kind of get that opportunity. Like what Grace was saying, we have so much talent within the filmmaking community and up and coming talent, to come. And like what Don said, it's about getting more voices in that documentary space for me specifically, as well as the narrative space. But I think, the important thing is I hope as a filmmaker that we all, hopefully there's more opportunities and we need to fight for that. But when those opportunities come, I really hope that us as filmmakers could really support each other and, to really come up and open doors for each other versus kind of fight for these scraps or fight for these limited spaces. I think they're always going to be not enough, so they will be limited. And I think, as a filmmaker, I think it's important for us to really help each other and kind of uplift all of us instead of kind of being competitive and fighting for those scraps.
Yeah, I mean, just as a follow-up, Don, do you see these kind of gatekeepers change? I think of Crime and Punishment and Minding the Gap were sort of big Asian American films. We just the Bruce Lee doc, Be Water. you know, the Asian American series that we worked on, like, do you see like the fact that those sort of higher profile things are being watched? Do you see that impacting the gatekeepers on the other side as much, or are they just kind of, they're like, oh, that's great, but like they're not quite in matching, like in terms of investment or you know, distribution or whatever?
So, certainly, I think in the nonprofit documentary space, you know, there are actual Asian American gatekeepers, right? Funders, executives, leaders, and that space has been pretty robustly built up the last few years. There are Asian American executives in commercial media documentary, but it's taken some time, right? I think Tad's point that Asian Americans have made a lot of progress in entertainment, albeit I think a certain kind of entertainment. I think it's important to acknowledge. I don't know that it's really, I think, you know, I think fish out of water kind of entertainment, right? The challenges of moving up professionally, right? You know, perhaps not real, like dug in Asian American stories, so to speak. And perhaps maybe that reveals why in the commercial space, our real stories have not found as much traction yet. I think it will. I think the next 5 years could be a very exciting time, but it's going to take a lot of back and forth and positioning and staking a claim, right?
Thanks. The next question is really about intercultural support and solidarity through filmmaking. Grace, having just done And She Could Be Next, do you want to speak about that a little bit?
What was the question?
I guess opportunities and, you know, opportunities for intercultural, interracial support within and solidarity within the filmmaking communities.
Oh, I mean, so And She Could Be Next it was a 2-part doc series on POV. It was exploring the transformative power of women of color in American politics, and we followed several races geographically, ethnically diverse across the country during the 2018 midterms. So it wasn't an Asian American project per se, although there were Asian American as well as Black, Latinx stories in there. Yeah, I mean, I think the project was conceived to be a multiracial coalition, sort of looking at the changing demographics in the United States, looking at, you know, what we call the new American majority. And we were able to, I mean, just because that's who we are as filmmakers, Marjan Safinia, who is Iranian American, Jyoti Sarda, also Indian American. We were the 3 producers, and Marj and I were the co-directors. But we also, you know, worked with a team of diverse, accomplished women of color directors, field directors, to put the project together. I just think that's the way I've always worked. I mean, I think it stems from that third world newsreel kind of ethos. That's always that's what I did in film school. I've always had diverse crews. And I just feel like the sort of further we come along in the values that we have and how we make films, that's just what's becoming the norm. If you make it the norm, if that's how you value who's telling the story. Yeah, I don't know if there's much to add, but it's how I feel like I've always tried to work, and I think it just seems of the moment, I guess.
Tad, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this specifically, I could only speak from my own Japanese American community, just because that's the, you know, perspective that I'm coming from. But, you know, I think for the Japanese American community through film specifically, I think previous generations, I think the goal as a community was for us to understand our own history and our own experience and to kind of come to grips with that. But I think now it's that next step where I think most of Japanese Americans kind of know their World War II story, know kind of the immigrant story. And I think the big next step is to really draw those parallels to the other communities and to, you know, so I think currently there's a lot of really good things going on both in media and outside of media in terms of trying to draw the parallels to to get our community to understand why the movement for Black lives is so important and crucial to support. The parallels between the immigrant detention centers and our own experience during World War II, similar to the fight for indigenous people for their land and their language. It's similar to what we've been struggling with kind of cultural and language retention. So I think that's the big thing, as well as just on a personal level, just trying to, like Grace said, trying to hire people of color, really trying to establish a relationship. I think by default, just because there's not enough of Asian American filmmakers, by default we've kind of are forced to really unite as people of color, or at least progressive voices. So I think we're coming from a history of that already, and I think it's just important to maintain that, but really kind of utilize our position as filmmakers to help build those bridges between our communities.
And then, yeah, Don, similarly, what are the opportunities you're seeing now for intercultural support and solidarity?
Well, I can only speak from CAM. I think within this year, we recognize that, for many years, a lot of Asian Americans, CAM included, you fight to assert a specific kind of identity or perspective. But we recognize, and we've tried over the last couple of years to try to think through how you can leverage, your position in the community on behalf of something better and greater good, right? So whether it's partnering on projects that aren't solely Asian American, or supporting other communities like people with disabilities, and really expanding the storytelling in the context of specific projects. We're trying, I think the consciousness that we have to not just be fighting on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of, certain values that can affect the field at wide. I think that's something many organizations are trying to really integrate into their missions.
I mean, do you see it as something that's difficult, I guess, given the resources, or do you think it's just a challenge that has to be met, basically?
I think the values are well, the values really should lead, but how that translates to more resources, I think that's it's always been a challenge, right? So it's not as if one of our communities, I think by and large, in many ways, right, Tad and Grace, documentary is as structurally problematic as practically any other industry where money is necessary. It is predominantly money what moves the industry, and people who are not people of color have generally gotten more access to them.
Yeah, no, I think we've all experienced it without getting into too much detail, but yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question is, I guess this is going to be really individual and personal to your own work, but what message or ideas do you want people to come away with after seeing your work? And you can speak kind of generally about your practice as a filmmaker, or maybe even specifically if there's a film that you want to discuss particularly. Feel free to kind of go either direction. Tad, how about you?
I think being kind of having the mentors that I've had, again, going back to learning to make film in the ethnic communications program from my dad, Robert Nakamura, I think he really hammered into us that, and I kind of carry on the same belief, is, I think I make films to remind ourselves, meaning Asian Americans, kind of who we are, where we come from, what our potential is, and really to remind, I guess specifically looking at my own films that I've made, is to remind ourselves that we have a history and legacy of activism and as artists, and I think that's not really, growing up, that's not really taught us. That's not taught to us by the educational system or the mainstream media. So to kind of both inspire younger generations, but also to remind them that they have a space. They don't have to feel like they're the first ones to do it. They're part of a legacy not in a pressure kind of way, but more in a, you belong here, whether it's fighting for other communities, whether it's, as activists or whether it's as artists. There's been plenty of people that carved a space for you to kind of continue to move on and take it to another level.
I mean, just as a follow-up, like, have you heard that kind of response from people who have watched your films? Are there any like specific examples of that you've heard?
Yeah, I mean, like as far back to, my first film, Yellow Brotherhood, I think a lot of people just didn't even know Japanese Americans grew up in Crenshaw. Similar things like that, like the fact that I think some people would be surprised that most of my aunties and uncles listen to Motown, right? All the way to, specifically, I made a film on a singer-songwriter named Chris Ijima, and in a film called A Song for Ourselves. And I think a lot of people had never heard of him or his music. So I think, those are just a couple examples.
Thanks. Grace, how about you? Whether it's generally for your career or specific to any films?
I think, me personally, my first, I'm not going to count the one I made in Korea. My first feature documentary, The Grace Lee Project, was really, it was a very personal documentary exploring stereotypes through all these women named Grace Lee. And I think a lot of my work really stems from questions about the world and, my place in it, not just as an Asian American, but as a woman, a daughter of immigrants, an American, now a mother, as a Korean American. And so, the work I generate myself really stems from trying to answer questions, with the Grace Lee Project is, what is this stereotype of the model minority, Asian women, with K-Town 92, which I think, this group is going to talk about. It's like, who gets to tell the story of the Los Angeles 1992 civil unrest, and She Could Be Next. It's like, what does it mean to have power in America, as women of color? These are questions that I personally grapple with, and I feel like it's not just me. It's like how do I bring this to like a larger audience so that we're all thinking about this question? So in a way, it's kind of taking what's very personal, but also instilling, larger questions about history, community, politics, race, into the mix. I'm just trying to understand the world we live in.
Filmmaking is like your own therapy, sort of, working out.
Very expensive and long.
It's like your Dear Diary.
So yeah, Don, you have a lot of credits, so I don't know how.
I have no personal mine is I dissociate. Not dissociate. I mean, obviously for CAM, our goal is to support filmmakers, right? So I think we thrive when the filmmakers tell their stories. I get as excited about what happens behind the camera as in front of. I guess that's the way to put it. That's my personal imprint on it.
Great, thanks.
I think Don is being really modest. Don's responsible for so many of us. He's a real champion of Asian American stories and voices, and like he's been in his position, and sort of experienced a lot of, kind of, I think Don, you and I are kind of this weird, like go between like your dad's generation and like younger filmmakers, right? So I think it's a really kind of interesting translator position to be in. So I really appreciate Don.
Thanks, Ruth. I wasn't trying to bait that.
Don owes you $5 now, Grace.
Okay. Last question before we go to kind of the viewer questions are, what advice do you have for people exploring mediums for amplifying the Asian American voice and experience? So I'm assuming this is specific to filmmakers, but I don't know, whenever I get this question, I'm kind of like, it all happened by accident for me, so I don't know really, but maybe you guys have a little more practical sort of of advice for someone. Don, do you want to start out?
What is the specific question again? It seems like a pretty...
Advice for people who want to explore mediums for amplifying Asian American voices.
Well, just jump in and do it, right? I think it is really stunning. I think when you look at the ADOC roster, how many filmmakers identify as Asian American filmmakers, right? On the one hand, that's in terms of the economics of the industry, it's hard to say, but in terms of the exciting storytelling and what's going to get revealed and what's possible, it's thrilling, right? So I just jump in, become a part of a really robust, exciting, dynamic community, and try to stake a claim to some stories that are meaningful to you that you want to dig into, right? So,
Tad, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, to echo what Don's saying, but not only to just do it, but I think, especially for filmmakers, I think people feel like they need to wait. I mean, of course, it is an expensive and resource-heavy field, but I think don't feel like you need to get a green light from, the gatekeepers or get funding. I think, I think some people feel like you need to be part of some kind of club or kind of get this cosign, and I really don't think you do. If anything, that kind of frees you up to do what you want to do. So yeah, I think, like Don said, just do it, but don't feel limited if you don't have the resources that you see other people having. And also too, I really think that the more self-serving you are just as an artist, I think the less people you're going to have to uplift you and kind of catch you when you fall. So I think you really, when you're thinking about what projects or really why you're doing it, kind of the trajectory that what you want to make, I think, if it's really just on an individual self-serving level, that's going to show in the long run. But if you are making films for a larger community, if you are doing it for, things bigger than yourself, it'll really resonate with audiences and other filmmakers. And I think that's when you're really going to get the support from other people is if your work actually kind of shows is not just for you and is to kind of a broader purpose.
And Grace, what is your advice?
I think the question was, how do we
amplify advice
stories,
for people who
right?
want to amplify Asian American stories?
Right. Their own or others.
I
I think there's so many ways to do it right now. Like, yeah, I'm just like, during the debate last night, I was just on Twitter, and I'm just so like amused and inspired by how much creativity there is like in these mediums. Everybody has seen the dog face, right? TikToks. Like, that's incredible. Like, that is art, like putting together all these things that you never expected would come together at once. I just, I feel like, I'm inspired by people who can be like, think outside of the box and be creative in how they get their story out there. And it doesn't always have to be like waiting for all, fundraising for a year and then like trying to get the equipment together. And, I think there's a question in the chat about how do we do this post-COVID? And I feel like there's a lot of reflection happening now about how do we do things differently, because it doesn't have to take up so many resources and, like be so difficult. Like, there's easier ways to connect with people, create community, and also, be creative.
Yeah, I think, well,
not easy, like more accessible.
I think it's important to note also, like, when things were very expensive in the early days of the dawn of Asian American documentary, like, people were very scrappy and kind of used whatever resources, kind of beg, borrow, and steal to tell the stories. It's kind of why I think a lot of Asian Americans were drawn to documentary. It felt kind of like gritty and like, we're in this age where we're not being represented, but we can find ways to make it happen. And I think now that everyone's got like a camera on their phone, you can kind of take a master class, or just you could learn how to light, on YouTube, or you can learn how to edit on YouTube or do whatever. So Um, I think about like my first documentary as just being a class that I took with Tad's dad, and you know, I never thought anything would come of it. Honestly, I thought I would, I don't know, go be a social worker and move back to Boston or something. So the fact that I'm here is really, I think, to Tad's point, a testimony about what community is and what Asian American support and kind of like mutual aid looks like, in a way, to support each other's talent and vision. And I think all of us who are on the panel have all done that in some regard for other filmmakers too. So I have a lot of like respect and gratitude for all the people that have been in my life who've helped me in terms of becoming a filmmaker. So yeah, I guess my closing advice, listening to everybody, is sort of like, yeah, just kind of go forward and do it, but try to do it in communities that will share and support your vision and kind of help you, you know, like don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to in certain ways, but like what's unique to you is your own perspective and your own vision of what's an important story to tell. So that kind of wraps up these questions, and we have some questions that came in through the chat. Let's see. I guess we could start with, this question is issues related to gender and the intersection of gender and race within the industry. I don't know, does anyone want to start in terms of that question? I know, I was like, I'm not going to ask Grace right off the bat. So, Don, let's put you in the hot seat. What do you
Well, actually, it's interesting in our community throughout, I think actually not just history in terms of the filmmakers, there's always been percentage-wise more women filmmakers than male, at least year to year in terms of applications who we fund. I think that number has been consistently high, but I think, you know, hand in hand with that is the question of access to resources and budgets and power. And then I think obviously outside of our industry, who wields that. But, you know, I think it is a point of pride that so many of the icons and leaders and the actual percentage of filmmakers in the Asian American community, it's women led. I think that's pretty, that has been from the get-go. I think that continues obviously now, but that's been really fundamental to our community specifically.
Tad, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges, you know, I think in general, you know, I think just as a male, you know, specifically a straight cisgender male in our communities, just really learning how to step back and to create more space. But I think, you know, things like specifically challenges that people been challenging all filmmakers, including, you know, within our communities, especially on crew, is just to hire, you know, make sure you hire more women on crew. Because I do think, you know, my experience, at least in my generation, I think, you know, a lot of the leadership in our filmmaking community are women directors. But when it comes down to, you know, camera people, you know, sound, things like that, you know, I think there's been a big push to really hire a lot more women, because there's you know a lot of really you know talented folks out there, and I think just in terms of also just content wise too, is I've, you know, been learning to just, instead of trying to force, you know, take up space to tell stories about more women, just to step back and, you know, create space for women to tell those stories themselves. I think that's, you know, I think a big thing that a lot of us are learning, continuing to learn. And that goes with, you know, organizations as well.
I mean, I just from my own past experience working on Asian Americans, like I think the main thing I learned is that like when women or women identifying people, female identifying people are in positions of executive or above the line kind of positions, like this is a terrible word, but it kind of trickles down. Like once you have those women who are the head producers or executive producers and directors, like just because of our own experiences, I think we're much more conscious of those things. So like immediately you almost like solve the problems of representation and diversity in terms of an gender equity issue. Like I think we were like 90% female on our, at least production staff. The field crew, I do think that, like Tad said, there's some more challenges in that in terms of, I think camera work and sound, like it is still more gendered towards male. But like I think we tried as much as possible to make sure we had a diverse an equitable staff and crew. But I mean, Grace, I think you said on And She Could Be Next, it was sort of like almost exclusively women of color from like top to bottom, I would say.
I mean, we had a couple white guys.
Sure, but like
but yeah, I mean, our DP's, he was immigrant, South Asian man. Sound, usually you hire sound people locally, and in places like Michigan or Georgia, they tend to be white guys, but they're still okay. I mean, the thing that's interesting is just having a diverse. I mean, we're making a film about representation, inclusivity, all of those things, and the new American majority. We wanted our crew to reflect that as well. Yeah, I mean, I think the question, how is it seen in the film industry? Like even in Asian Americans, when we had like mostly women in positions of, director, producer, all of that, there's just habits that people have where like, taking notes, and like I had a male editor who's a friend of mine. I'm the director and the producer, but like the male executive, not Don, would talk to the editor, like I'm sitting right there, but the men tend to like talk to the men. Like, I've dealt with it my whole life because most people don't think that I'm the director. Like I distinctly remember I've been in like film festivals, and you show up, and people ask, where's the director, or assume that I'm a production assistant, or this is when I looked younger than I don't look young anymore. But back then, the assumption was I was the PA, right? The production assistant. So I'm so used to it, but it's also why I'm so, adamant about making the crews, be reflective of my reality. So.
Yeah, I mean, from my own experience, I mostly started in post-production because I work with Walt, who is an editor, and I can't even tell you how many assistant editors they would come to me with their technical questions because I run a facility. But when I gave them the answer, they were like, well, that doesn't make sense. And I was like, why are you even asking? Or I'd have people be like, in my 20 years as an assistant editor, I've never heard of that problem before. And I'm like, I don't care, but there is this sort of idea that somehow like I am not as technical. I can't tell if it's like youth or gender or race. I don't know. It's probably a combination of all those things.
I mean, look at Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris can't even like get a word in edgewise during the debate, or like be able to speak a complete sentence because the other person thinks.
Oh, you're having your moment. You're having your CNN moment.
That's great.
Anyway.
Right on cue.
Yeah,
exactly.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Anyway, yes. So yeah, there is a lot of gendered things that are sort of ingrained that even if you're a conscious person, you actually have to kind of actively battle.
Yes.
It's just too funny. Okay, let's see. Question. Okay, we have let's see. What will Asian American storytelling look like post-COVID? I mean, I don't know if this
When is post-COVID anyway?
Yeah, I know. We don't know what post-COVID will be, but I'm not sure if this is more to do with, the practicalities of filming in a COVID world. But I personally don't know. I don't know if you guys have an answer to that. I mean, we're all trying to figure out the actual what it will look like to film, but in terms of what will the storytelling look like, I mean, hopefully we're still making progress in terms of, you know, more Asian American stories. But
Yeah.
I don't know if COVID, do you think COVID changes that? I guess.
I think. Well, I mean, I was gonna say, you know, I think we're working on COVID, not necessarily post-COVID, and I think it's a moving target because every month it's different. But I mean, yeah, production is one thing, right? How do you shoot on location with older subjects at risk, kind of demographics, but also too like post production, right? How do you function when a lot of the post houses are closed or just starting to open? But I'm, you know, also a big one, and this involves everyone, is distribution and audience, right? When are we actually going to be comfortable going to a theater? You know, so I think these are all questions we're trying to figure out. But I think the biggest one for me is the distribution and the audience participation is the big one that I don't really know what's going to happen with that.
Oh, I guess for clarification, it is kind of, have things generally changed for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with like things like the China virus being, you know, like, I mean, we know that there's more violence against Asian Americans and kind of more blatant, explicit things happening, people getting hurt. In terms of what that means for the future of our storytelling as documentarians, I don't know. What did do?
Yeah, for the Asian American community at large, I've noticed anecdotally, there's a lot more thinking out loud about what should we all be here to do, and what is our responsibility. How that applies to documentary, I think that's still to be considered. I think like, and She Could Be Next demonstrates that sense. In the Asian American series, we tried to be very honest and thoughtful about. You know, at one point, I think we were all very proud of in that series was how many other series about different communities of color think about their relationships to others, right? And I think we tried to be very thoughtful about both the tensions and paying respect, you know, in the context of Black history in America, right? And how might the Asian American narrative have been framed, you know, used, you know, as a wedge, and also how we have to pay respect to the civil rights movement and how it really shaped our community's history, right? So I think that intentionality and consciousness, I think that's emerged this year in ways that might not have been community-wide before, right? So I hope that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think our as Asian Americans, our history is very, like, Asian American Pacific Islanders like have suffered from like settler colonialism and suffered, you know, like have experienced this kind of like plague, yellow peril idea before. So this is not necessarily new, but I guess the question is just how will it impact people's storytelling through documentary? I mean, sometimes I feel like I don't want to keep hammering the same issues over and over again, but it seems like we're not learning from history because we don't know the history. So like there is a sort of cyclical feel to some of it. So I hope that if people were not aware of those issues before, like if it illuminates it for them, then, you know, that they will have more an investment in making sure that the portrayal of Asian Americans is like sort of both historically accurate and also respectful of who we are as like an AAPI community. But, all right, so we have 5 minutes left. Let's see, what else do we have here? Question for panel. Okay, we did gender, we did storytelling, we did... Okay, this is very specific, I think, to a practice of filmmaking, but like if your vision of the story that you want to tell is very different from what others believe, how do you balance other people's perspective? And should you even care, really, if people kind of disagree with your point of view? I don't know if you have, as a filmmaker, have experienced that kind of thing where you feel like you're the story you're trying to put forth or your specific point of view is kind of contrary to kind of maybe what's accepted or a norm of a potential viewer viewing population. Has that come up for anybody?
I think it really depends. I mean, there's such a spectrum of what kind of films you can make, and also what type of filmmaker you are or you identify as. So, you know, for me personally, like I don't, I know my films aren't quote unquote fair and balanced, or I'm not a journalist, and so I think for me to make films, at least for me, a lot of good films I see have a perspective. And I think you need to, at least for me, I need to make sure my films have a perspective. So I guess to answer the question, like, it really depends what your target audience is and what your goal is with your film. So if it, you know, so that really depends on how balanced or not, how much you don't care or do care with, you know, how, if people agree or disagree with what you're saying. So I really feel like it all depends on the goals of the film.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can see it. Yeah, I guess I think I would make a distinction that documentary and journalism are not the same. I think people are trying to make it the same, or that one is sort of in the modern era being substituted for another, but they are different.
They're blending a lot more.
Yeah, there's a lot more blending of it, but I don't know. Grace, do you have any specific?
I mean, the way I saw that question was, and Todd's absolutely right, like, who is your audience? And yeah, everybody has an interpretation. I mean, the minute you pick the topic, understand that, you know, you're going to explore something in set amount of time. I mean, when we made Asian Americans, the series, we have 5 hours to tell 150 years of history. You know, we're going to make some decisions that people aren't going to be happy with. We're not going to include everybody. And, you know, the way I kind of made peace with that was knowing, like, okay, we have 5 hours. Like, if you think that we're going to include all of this history in, you know, 5 separate hours, that's impossible, you know. But what we can do is offer sort of, you know, small bites at, you know, different ideas within this history that people, if they're interested, could continue to pursue either in readings, or maybe there's another series that comes after it. But, you know, here was a chance to kind of sort of throw out, like, you know, here's one view of how we would put together 5 hours of 150 years of history. So, I mean, there's always more specific reasons of, like, why did you include that? Why didn't you include that? You know, that's my prerogative as the filmmaker. And, you know, oftentimes I'm making films because somebody didn't include this perspective before. You know, K-Town 92 was created because of all of the, you know, many years of media coverage of 1992 in Los Angeles that was heavily based on, you know, these kind of problematic images of people of color looting or shooting people or etc., but not really going back and understanding, like, what were people's actual experiences, you know, from on the ground. So yeah, I think it's kind of, I always sort of see it as, in a long view, it's kind of in play with, like, the larger conversation, you know.
I mean, I would also say, just if you're an Asian American Pacific Islander person trying to make an Asian American Pacific Islander specific film, like, you are already sort of fighting a general idea of what should be on television or the screen, right? So, like, you're sort of making that choice knowing, like,
yeah,
you know, it's going to be a tough sell to whoever the gatekeepers are. So you're almost already starting that just by making the decision.
You're on a path.
Yes, you've sort of chosen a path. I think we're pretty much all set. I guess, thank you so much again for, you know, being part of this fun little group that I don't get to see all together too often. And it was really fun. Thanks.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here. Just to let the audience know, you can watch a lot of these films that we've been talking about in the Dine-In Theater. And you can also catch Eurie at the award ceremony at 3 for the Community Award. We're really, really excited about honoring Flash Cuts, and just thank you everyone for being on this panel and sticking through all this technology stuff. All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.